Nice to be back at SAS. I actually missed it last year, so the APT10 stuff was 2 years ago. So back a little bit older, a little bit fatter, and a dad now as well, which was a bit of a change for life. But given last time we were here, we did the APT10 stuff. I thought it was pretty useful to stick with the same sort of supply chain theme this time around, and actually works pretty well with the theme of the conference. So I'm going to pick up on a few bits and pieces, so 3 distinct things. One of them is a little bit of a sort of a almost refresher on like how did we actually get to this point in terms of supply chain attacks, and then talk about 3 distinct examples that we've seen in some of our either research or incident response cases over the last, I guess, year or so. So a little bit of a refresh on what APT10 we're doing post-Cloud Hopper and the sort of in the 18 months running up to the indictments last December. A little bit about another implant that we found actually while looking for APT10 that we actually think is related to a different actor that's targeting part of the technology supply chain, and then a little bit about telco supply chain targeting as well. Excuse me. So, kind of, how did we actually get here? I mean, it's kind of no surprise, and we've heard a lot about it yesterday, everything from the hardware side of things yesterday morning through to the software side of stuff with Shadowhammer. But we've effectively got this kind of digital ecosystem where trust is really being targeted in it. And what we've seen, and it's kind of really no different to what Lazarus and some of the actors are doing on the cybercrime side of things, they're effectively moving up the value chain and targeting areas of concentration risk. So going from targeting kind of personal bank accounts kind of 6, 7 years ago, through to corporate banking, through to the actual clearinghouses and kind of central banks. So effectively moving up the value chain in a lot of this stuff. But things like the software supply chain targeting aren't actually that new. I think the first example I found whenever I was looking back in the history of this stuff was back in 2011, where I think it was SSOF in South Korea was targeted and was serving malicious updates from their update server. We then also have another South Korean example, I think in 2013. We've got the Monju Japanese nuclear plant incident in 2014, which was a malicious update to a media player. We've got then the Energetic Bear Havex guys targeting ICS installers, and effectively compromising the ICS software providers and bundling their malware with the legitimate updates for those software. I think it was 2014, 2015. And then we start getting into 2016, which is where some of the more recent stuff has actually come out in this space. So kind of very quick refresher, if any of you guys are unfamiliar with this stuff. The Cloud Hopper attacks were effectively IT managed service providers being targeted, and the only public number, which was actually announced in a conference by the Australian Signals Director a few months ago around the time of the indictments, was that 8 global MSPs had been targeted. I think the number is actually a little bit higher than that. I think we've got 10 or 12 on the list. But it was effectively breaching IT managed service providers to exploit the trust they had into their customer networks, being able to effectively hop around those networks and get whatever they want out of it. Then we obviously had the NotPetya side of things, so the kind of accounting software being targeted. Kind of Wired did this phenomenal article on it. Kaspersky's ShadowPad report, which again was fascinating. We've seen the recent example of that continuing with the Shadowhammer side of stuff. CCleaner was, again, I'm just fascinated by the scale of this stuff. So kind of 2.3 million systems getting a malicious update to serve a second stage to about 40 systems targeting something like 11 companies. So like really, really interesting in terms of the scale of this side of things. And then the Talos guys, you'll hear them talk a little bit today as well about some of the DNS infrastructure targeting. So effectively part of the kind of like the registrars and name server panels being targeted by 2 different clusters of activity, one Iranian, one non-Iranian, which is also kind of interesting. So we've effectively built, I think, a whole set of systems and processes that rely on a lot of these kind of black box things behind the scenes without really factoring the risk of some of that into how we actually deal with risk as organizations. And so whenever attackers manage to find a way of navigating through that, it always has some quite interesting consequences. So I guess moving into the examples, because I've only got kind of 20 minutes to go through these 3 things. A little bit about what APT10 had been up to following the indictment, or following the Cloud Hopper report almost 2 years ago. So we actually had at the time, the intended effect. So we wanted to really try and push the bad guys back a little bit to give some of the victims and the MSPs a bit of breathing space to try and remediate, because a few of them were struggling quite a lot. So within kind of a week or two of the report coming out, at least from our visibility, APT10 had pretty much abandoned most of the infrastructure. They'd stopped kind of tinkering with the victims that they had access to. And it was about, I think, 6 or 7 weeks before we saw the very first indication of them starting to get back in action again. And that was with a new variant of the Quasar rat loader that they had originally been using to target the MSPs. I'll touch on this in a little bit, but if you remember, their original method of dealing with Quasar rat was to have what we called a hunter module, which was a .NET payload that effectively looked recursively in a directory on disk to try and find an encoded, an AES encoded payload that it could decrypt and then launch. But you couldn't tell what one it was because it was trying to launch every single file in that subdirectory. So unless you had a copy of it and could enumerate the directory to try and find the payload, and you had the keys from the loader, you couldn't actually decode the actual Quasar rat payload, which was quite a nice way of doing it, and it made some of the defense quite difficult. But that was one of the things that they evolved quite a bit, and I'll touch on a couple of examples of that as well. So 3 to 6 months out, we saw quite a few new samples of the Quasar rat appearing, and some new samples of red leaves appearing in the wild as well. And most of that was being used to directly target Japanese organizations and entities. And we've got example kind of spear phishing lures that they were using to do that sort of stuff, and it was all Japanese language, kind of invitations to seminars and lectures that were all themed appropriately given their interests. So that wasn't really a surprise that they were resuming some of their activity and trying to get back up to tempo. And a lot of the mistakes that they had made in the run-up to kind of early 2017 around infrastructure overlaps and other things that meant that they could actually they were quite easy to track. They had completely changed. They actually got much, much better at managing their infrastructure, separating it completely from a lot of the legacy stuff. And some of that was kind of prompted before the Cloud Hopper report. I think it was Cylance that had put out a blog that detailed a lot of their domain registration habits, which made the infrastructure easier to track. So I think it was one domain that they had put out just before the Cloud Hopper report that was the first one to use Privacy Protect services. And that was something they kept doing then the whole way whenever they resumed activity and actually got much, much better at managing the infrastructure. And then about 6 months later, running through to really the time of the indictments in December last year, they went back after the MSPs in a big, big way on some of the MSP customer base. So we saw quite a lot of targeting of things like global media organizations and a few other sectors, but they went big after the MSPs again. And we saw quite a lot of experimentation, I guess, with new malware families. So we saw them trying out, or what we think was APT10 trying out NetWire in one instance. We've got examples of them using Cobalt Strike, POSH-C2, Coadic, PowerSploit, PSE. Some of those, Cobalt Strike in particular, seem to be used more against Japanese entities like telcos, and were quite successful at compromising some big ones. So by spring, summer 2018, and probably no coincidence that some of the DHS alerts on APT10 activity were starting to come out around this time, they'd actually managed to get back into some major MSPs, and in fact some MSPs that we don't think they had access to prior to the Cloud Hopper report. So we estimate, and we could be wrong on this, it's just based on our visibility, they probably had access to 4 or so MSPs again by last summer, including some of the new ones. So they were really starting to get quite good access again. So touching on the Quasar rat evolution, and I know kind of Bart and some of the FireEye guys are going to do a deeper talk on this, but just kind of picking a couple of examples. One of the things that they did post the Cloud Hopper report was switch from having that .NET Hunter module to actually having a C++ DLL that was installed as a service. That DLL decoded the .NET Hunter module and then launched it inline with the CLR, the .NET CLR, which then did the usual thing of going and hunting for a payload on disk. But a lot of the strings, which previously weren't encoded, they then started encoding in the binary, so we'd kind of encrypted stuff like this. It was all AES-256 encoded, but the IV and the key were stored in the binary. So it was pretty easy to actually write a quick script. There's also an IDPython script that we wrote to do some of this stuff. But you can drop out the keys pretty easily. The only thing they had actually encoded wasn't the details of the service names and so on, but it was actually the strings that gave away that they were looking for a specific instance of the .NET CLR to then run and launch the payload. So you could actually see all of the strings that they were using to try and do that once you decoded this stuff. But they were pretty good at blending in. So 2 examples of the service DLLs that we found on screen, so kind of work folder service and WBio service. Some of these really looked quite legitimate. So if you were hunting for these, aside from the file names and some of the weird SVC host parameters, and I think actually some of these were legitimate. They were effectively finding services that weren't used and then replacing the DLLs. They were actually getting pretty slick at blending in. So I think we probably have about, 12 examples of the new quiz RRAT variants, at least in terms of the different service names and so on. The other thing that they started doing, which we found quite amusing in late 2017, was trolling researchers. And I think some folks will have probably seen blogs about this or seen it in their own research. But September 2017, we found a red leaves sample that had these weird section names in it, St. Peter 0 and St. Peter 1. And at the time, we didn't really know what it was about and who St. Peter was. Later on, we saw some other Russian strings. And so this is probably them kind of shortening St. Petersburg into some of the section names. November 2017, this was quite a good one. So if you look at the strings on the right-hand side, powered by APT 632185 North Korea. Can you make an analysis report for me? I'm waiting here for you. I'm here waiting for you. That was kind of a weird one to see embedded in the binaries. December 2017, they then went back to referencing JPCert. So if you remember, these guys, I think a year or two earlier, had registered jpcert.org just a few days after JPCert had published a blog on some of their activity. January 2018, more strings. According to the analysis report, some Japanese analysts have always been portrayed as a bit of a joke. Make a try. I'm sure this variant can't easily be detected by Yara rules or antivirus signatures. Actually, it could. Which kind of defeated the purpose a little bit. January 2018, we then have a Pyongyang reference in the section names. And March 2018, we have Zelenog. Again, we didn't know what Zelenog was. It turns out Zelenograd is a suburb of Moscow. So again, back to the very first one in September 2017 with the Russian references. So the fact that these guys seem to be quite almost happy with their publicity, happy to troll researchers, led us to start making some assertions in our intel reporting for customers. And so in March 2018, I think it was just after the Zelenog example, this was one of the statements that we had made in a private intel report for customers. So everything they were doing indicates they are confident in a significant level of air cover along with a degree of operational impunity at a national level, which then turned out to be pretty true. So the lovely chaps over at Intrusion Truth did a very good job at piecing together a bunch of open source info and maybe some info that wasn't open source about APT10 and suggested they were effectively working for a contractor for China's intelligence service, the Ministry of State Security in Tianjin. And then the Department of Justice followed with indictments in December last year that effectively pointed the finger at a couple of those specific contractors. If you are interested in any open source research, there's actually more you can find about the individuals that work for those contractors, particularly because some of the Chinese universities very helpfully put spreadsheets of their student graduation results online. And so you can actually see lists of people, or some individuals at least, that have graduated and gone to work for these contractors. And in fact, they even more helpfully provide the name of the receiver at those companies, effectively the person they're going to work for at those companies. So you can start piecing together a little bit more about what the organization might look like. And one of the interesting ones, particularly given how much APT10 targeted Japan, was the fact that some of those individuals were actually graduates from Japanese language courses in language universities. So again, kind of no surprise given a bit about what they did. So that's a little bit about what APT10 were up to. Switching track a little bit, one of the things that we always try to do, I guess like most of you guys, is whenever we find a malware family, we always try to build a bunch of different methods of tracking new variants of that. And some of the red leaves samples had a specific type of shellcode loader at the start. And in tracking that shellcode, we stumbled across a new sample. And we actually think this is maybe not related to APT10, which is Red Apollo in our naming convention. So we've called this actor Red Strix, which is actually a mythical kind of flying animal, a bit like an owl, which will become clear in a minute. But there may possibly be some APT10 overlap here. We aren't entirely sure. So hash is on there if anybody's interested. The overlap with APT10 was this shellcode egg hunting rule with this AFBF value. It effectively found the payload with that, loaded and executed the DLL, set up a service for persistence, all themed after NVIDIA, which kind of matched the side loading combination that they were using. Then kicked off another egg hunt to find the what we called red enters DLL. I'll explain that name in a sec. And that DLL then repeated the same egg hunting process to get 2 additional DLLs and kicked off this mutex so that it could check if it was running or not. So that was all pretty standard. The bit that became a little bit more interesting was the fact that whenever it got past the mutex check, it set up an HTTP server using the Windows HTTP server API and installed a handler for that URI, so the /topics/ kind of random value URI. And accepts post commands that are encoded AES-128 and base64. So it's really basic passive implant. No command and control activity. It just installs, waits, and waits for an attacker to connect in and post some legitimate commands in that encoded format. So basically, got command execution, reverse shell, and some shellcode execution. The reason that we called it red enters was because we obviously found it looking for the shellcode combination for one of the red leaves stuff, but this is passive rather than active command and control, so it's waiting for an attacker to come in as opposed to beaconing out. So red leaves, red enters. Get it? See what I did? So the other bit that was interesting following on from that research, on one of the victims that red enters implant was deployed on, we also found another similar sample. So a slightly different code base, but it was a project that the developer called the OWL. So those 2 debug paths, and you'll find the samples if you look for them, are the dropper and an IIS plugin. And they actually have embedded RT bitmap resources, so a similar technique to how Turla and some others have loaded some of their payloads. They've got a little configuration blob stored. Again, if you use that marker in a Yara rule, you'll find some of the samples. The config basically has the path to drop the DLL out to, the HTTP API endpoints to register, port and protocol to listen on, and this one, or at least one of these ones, intercepts the /topics endpoint. So again, it waits for incoming commands on that stuff. 3 different variants of it. So we've got an encoded command that just gets decoded and passed through to command.exe. We have this PP endpoint, which sets up a new proxy. And then there's actually another sort of PP endpoint for that specific proxy. So this is effectively another passive implant that can be used to tunnel further into a network, and actually kind of a little bit like HiKit in some instances. You could chain them together whenever they got in, or whenever you get them all installed. So 2 related projects. We also found an Apache version of this in January this year. So again, developer still calls it OWL. There are command line switches for the installer, and that kind of suggests the actor already has interactive access to the environment, so they can actually give it the right command line parameters to install. This one looks for the Apache httpd.conf, edits that for persistence. It actually takes one of the command line parameters, determines what load module directive it uses. So the actor probably works out something that's not being used, and then uses that to load the Apache. And this one intercepts index include con. Debug testing obviously wasn't great, so one of the commands is a file copy, except they've written xcpoy rather than xcopy, so that's clearly not going to work very well. But we've got this kind of set of implants which are definitely related. Some of them are kind of listening on the same paths. They were co-located on the same system, so there's obviously some kind of relationship between them. But what made it interesting to us was the targeting. So obviously there's no C2 infrastructure, so we can't pull NetFlow, we can't kind of grab C2 images, those sorts of things. We had to actually scan for the victims on this, and every single one of them that we could find was in Taiwan. And the targeting, aside from a couple of government victims, seemed to be exclusively based on the technology sector, and in particular, a bunch of subsidiaries of a very large kind of technology company, not entirely dissimilar to the shadow hammer attacks that we've read about. So there's still a bunch of activity that we're looking into in this and trying to collaborate with the victims to work out what was actually done with that stuff. But we've got effectively a new implant that we didn't know about before, an actor that we didn't really know about before, that seems to be very heavily going after the technology sector in Taiwan. So the last bit on this, the other quirk that we found was that the encoding for the traffic in the oil samples used, it was base64, but RC4 as well. And we initially kind of implemented it and then couldn't work out why the traffic wasn't decoding cleanly whenever we were testing it. And it was because there was a modification to the RC4 algorithm. So on both the KSA and PRGA parts of the RC4 algorithm, there was an increment. So this kind of +1 increment and the +1s over on the right-hand side are non-standard for the RC4 algorithm. And because it's such a short algorithm, it's actually quite easy to write a Yarrow rule for this code base. And the weird thing was, across every kind of repo that we had access to across the VT retro hunt, and Juan helped us out with a couple of other bits, and some other data we've got access to, the only other instances that we could find of this algorithm were in legitimate apps by the software arm of one of China's largest companies. So we don't know if that's a really strong connection, whether it's somebody's just pulled code from a forum and reused it, but something that we're going to dig into a little bit more as well. So, last one. So we've done, I guess, the kind of process outsourcing supply chain. We've done a bit about technology, and now switching track into the communications supply chain. And I'm not even going to start the debate over whether this is WinNTI or WinT or however you want to pronounce it. I'm sticking with WinT. We also don't have visibility of whether it's lead or barium or which other cluster it is. So whenever I say WinT, please take that as a WinT user, the actual malware family. But what we've been figuring out is that a WinT user is aggressively targeting global telco companies. And we've got evidence of them targeting at least 10 large telecommunication companies. Most of the samples that we've been looking at for the telco targeting, because there's obviously a lot of other targeting on the go, and some of it has been in the press in the last week or two, in Germany in particular. But the telco targeting seems to use a very specific campaign code. So if you see any WinT configs with a swear word in them as one of the campaign codes, that's probably related to some of the telco targeting. And the compromises in this instance span Asia, Europe, and Africa, and a lot of them seem very specifically aligned to areas of interest for China. So Kazakhstan with the Belt and Road Initiative, India, Kenya, so a couple of other bits of, potentially a couple of other bits of Africa as well, which are very much aligned to Chinese investment. So most people think of the WinT implant as a Windows rootkit, and a lot of the previous reporting has been about the Windows side of things. They also have a Linux implant, which is what they're using partly to target some of the telcos. So I think we've got 5 samples of that to date. I think 3 of them are on VT. They're all zero detection. As at the point I wrote this. So if you want to go and have a look, the hash that's on there is the most recent one that we found uploaded to VT just a few weeks ago. The C2 for that is bbcnews.deepseaengine.com, which I think was probably from late summer last year, was the first time that we've got any passive DNS on it in terms of resolutions. The Linux and Windows variants share a really significant overlap in code. The other interesting bit, and I guess Silas and others have probably looked at this a lot more in depth over the years, but they actually use a custom IP stack based on LWIP. They've tweaked it a little bit to remove some of the debug markers and other things that would give it away that they're using that stuff. But that's actually fundamentally broken a little bit in terms of how it does kind of SYN-ACK responses and things, which actually makes it a little bit easier to kind of fudge whenever you're doing some testing on the implants as well. The campaign codes don't always seem to match the victims or the targets, so we've got evidence of campaign codes that might look like it's for a completely different organization inside a victim in a completely different sector, so there's not always a one-to-one match. And they've also got this as SSL userland rootkit that they're using for some of the activity as well, which is kind of interesting. The other bit, particularly interesting for us, given one of the intrusions that we investigated from a Winty user back in, I think, 2015 in the semiconductor industry, had an element of access operations. So the actor looked like they might have obtained access from another Chinese espionage or China-based espionage group. So we've always been a little bit curious about how these guys work with others. There looks like there may be an element of that in some of the telco targeting as well. So if we work right to left on this graph, just because that's the way that Maltego laid it out, the two hashes are the Linux Winty implants. The C2 for those is ip.1ds.me. That TLD we think is actor owned. It has another subdomain of news.1ds.me, which resolves to that IP address in the middle, 43.239.156.63. The bit that's interesting is that the other domains that resolve to that and some of the stuff that you can then pivot out to from there. So if you use the email address that was used to register those domains and you get out to the other ones, so things like doc.gov.online and mailmethod.space and files.gov.online on the left-hand side of the graph, that's all associated with another actor, generally known as Deepcliff, because some of their early domain registrations were deepcliff@sina.com was the email address used for it, which heavily targets the Tibetan community and may be working with the Winty group to do that by the looks of this stuff. So the targeting of this campaign, I mentioned we know of at least 10 telcos. Most Western stuff that we've got is South Africa and the UK, but much of the rest of it is what you would expect for a lot of traditional kind of Chinese or China-based actor targeting. So Qatar, Pakistan, Burma, India, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, Kenya, Kazakhstan. So all broadly aligned with strategic initiatives in many cases. So I guess just to wrap up, I've got 3 minutes, so we'll be bang on time. We've got to a point where we know there are multiple state actors focused on targeting multiple dimensions of supply chain, and that's everything from the hardware stuff that we heard about yesterday through to kind of software, process outsourcing, and technology. There's also evidence of organized crime starting to do stuff in that space too. So some of the Fin groups that would traditionally target retail companies directly seem to be starting to swim upstream a little bit and trying to get into kind of the POS manufacturers and others. So they might actually have better access from that vantage point. No surprise, we think this is going to be a big focus through the rest of 2019. We're probably going to see pretty sustained outsourcer and software targeting. And just in terms of things that people can do, network segmentation and reviewing that with things like auto-update mechanisms in mind is going to be quite an interesting challenge, I think, for a lot of organizations, because most of us have just never thought about that sort of stuff. From APT10, particularly, I guess, APT31 as well, which has been documented now as doing some MSP targeting in Norway. Looking at MSP segmentation, so making sure that the MSPs can't log in to the customer networks without 2FA, without going through really heavily monitored jump boxes, etc. And kind of the basic stuff. So just-in-time privileged account provisioning, least privilege attributable accounts. So if weird stuff turns up in logs, it's pretty obvious that it's from, I don't know, an MSP, for example. And then some really boring stuff is actually becoming increasingly important, like kind of assurance programs and contractual clauses. So what can you actually do whenever you've got a suspicion that an MSP, for example, is involved in some sort of intrusion? So that was just a really quick run through 3 things that we've seen over the last few months in the supply chain. And I suspect there'll be a whole bunch of other stuff fall out of this. But if you're tracking any of these things and you want to collaborate, I probably raised more questions than I've answered with some of this stuff. So come and chat, and we'll be very, very happy to share info. And with that, I'm done. So thank you.